I don't have a kind of like anxious attachment to money. I just want to have a comfortable life.
Right.
I'm looking for financial independence, not wealth. Anyone who knew me, Kristin's going to be a doctor. That was just it. But then my boyfriend at the time, we're in Paris, and he just collapses. And I think watching him die.
Sorry, what?
Yes.
So you guys are just walking.
Yeah.
And he just collapses.
Yeah, and he dies there. And I was like, I can't save lives. I'm not gonna save lives. Like, my dad died over 20 plus years ago. In my dad's estate, he accounted for taking care of his family members and setting up a trust for us. To date, that trust is still taking care of those family members.
20 years later.
Yeah, 20 plus years later. I've never liked my dad.
You've never liked him?
Never liked him, never respected him. The fact that one of my brothers would probably have killed him if he hadn't died. He had cancer, flying out for treatments, doing all of these things. He was getting better, blah, blah, blah. And then to just die because you don't have proper monitoring equipment, the nurse was probably sleepy and so fell asleep, and then the man just dies. Like, it's so wasteful.
Yeah.
Like, let this man die because my brother beats him to death or something. Like...
Welcome back to another episode of Financially Incorrect. I am your host, Barrack, and as usual, we're bringing you different money stories, money journeys, and hopefully you can learn a thing or two. This podcast is proudly sponsored by FX Pesa, who very soon are launching in Tanzania. My guest today is rating my hosting ability and level of condescension through the episode. But her name is Kristin Wilson. She is I want to get the right word right, the managing partner at Innovate Africa Fund and the chief strategy officer at Spirit. And she's West African. So this is actually the first time that we are crossing borders as well. So welcome to Financially Incorrect.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah?
You nailed that. You didn't do too bad.
It wasn't too bad, right?
Yeah, I didn't pick up on the condescension just yet.
Maybe it's going to come through later.
Yeah. No, I'm doing this for the viewers. For the people who've been watching you and they've just been like, this guy.
Like, this guy is just, Anyway, strategy. Tell me about strategy. What do you do as a strategist?
Okay, that's a good question. I didn't know we were going to go there.
Yeah.
So think ahead, I think, is the simplest way to put it. Day-to-day running a business or running a project, you're kind of bogged down with the operational pieces, right? You're thinking about making what's in front of you work. And I think actually some of the best leaders are good at solving for the here and now. But I think strategy is about thinking about what next, right? And how what's happening now, what's happened in the past, and what's likely to happen can be kind of leveraged for best outcomes for whatever your project or venture or whatever it is.
Okay.
So that's how I explain strategy and how I think about strategy. And as you can imagine, that it automatically means most people are like, that's okay. We'll figure that out.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was going to ask you. Like, why do you think it's undervalued?
So I think two reasons, right? I think it's especially undervalued in our cultural context on the continent because we live in crisis, right? And what that means when you're living in crisis is that you are often really concerned about what's happening now, right? And thinking about how to get through to the next day. Somebody asked me, when is your flight? And I was like, I have so much to do right now that, and I know it's not right now, so I'll figure it out when it's then. And that I think is how many of us live, right? It occurred to me, I was like, do I need a visa for Tanzania? And I'm supposed to be there very soon.
Yeah.
And, so bad planning there, right? Bad strategy there. And so I think it's just when you're bogged down with the today and all of that, it's really hard to see the value, especially if you haven't been in a context where you've seen the value of that thinking ahead and that planning ahead. So I think that accounts for a lot of it being undervalued.
Yeah.
I also think so. There's a lot of great conversations, even like online, on TED Talks and all those things, and podcasts about what people have learned, right? Looking back. And very few conversations about what's coming. And I think that, so we also, and this is not just cultural, it's not just the continent, I think generally as people, because of this artifact of memory, we do have this fixation with looking back, looking at what could I have done differently, what happened, what did I learn, and then not always having that same strength of instinct to say, okay, what next? How do I do the next thing better? How do I go forward, and so on? So I think all of those little behavioral, maybe even biological things result in a kind of impetus to undervalue strategy. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
We're going to go a bit more into your work on it later, but let me ask you a couple of sort of left field questions, right? Because you told me that you identify as a West African.
Yeah. To be fair, I identify as like a Black African woman, but from a kind of like ethnic,
like
when
where
people are trying to place
from,
me, where are you from? I'm like, oh, I'm West African.
Yeah.
Because I think that's helpful for thinking about even my own like conceptualization of my identity and myself is definitely deeply rooted in
West Africa.
Ideas.
Okay. Do you think, or do you feel like there's a negative connotation to the term African? And what I mean by that is, I don't know, they've been seated in different places, whether it's a public forum, whatever the case is, and someone will say African, and I automatically have like a visceral reaction to what they're saying, where I'm like, no, don't say that. So do you think there's like a negative, or is that my personal experience?
I think it depends on the room you're in, right? Yeah. Like if the room you're in is like a visa application appointment, it probably hurts. I think if you're sitting in London, trying to find some good food, it probably helps to be African, right? I say that facetiously, but I think context, right? I think in general, it's harder for us from a kind of like geopolitics, global politics positioning to be, and I will say Black Africans, right? Because apparently there are non-Black Africans, right?
Right.
I've been told.
Right.
And so I think that idea of being Black and African is, I think, carrying two forms of socio-political burden that, can be difficult. But I think for me, for most of my life, and maybe some of it is recapture, but actually I started to feel very positively and very proudly about it. And I feel grateful for that because I think I definitely, I recognize what you're saying. I've seen spaces I've been in where I almost feel like the people are working to show that they are global citizens,
right,
and not African,
right.
And so I see people who have that, who carry that burden, right? I don't. I'm fine to be called an African, to be considered African, and all of those things. But I think it's because I was lucky. I think I grew up in a context that was very proudly African, very Pan-African. My house was full of, Kwame Nkrumah?
Yes.
Yeah, so my house was full of, Nkrumah's, writings, more from him as an intellectual and not so much really thinking about him as a president and all of those things. But just his intellectual thinking. I spent a lot of my early childhood, reading some of the earliest thinkers about Blackness and, Pan-Africanism. I went to a school in high school that I think our motto was like knowledge in the service of Africa. Okay. So I think I got lucky. I think I hit the lottery where growing up, even though I could see all of the messaging and I knew all of these things that you're talking about, I also was told, this is great. This is good.
Right.
And there's a specific thing about your positionality that you can leverage for real good in the world. Yeah. And I feel grateful for that.
Yeah, I've been trying to reverse that reaction and that feeling around it. But, I guess with time it will come.
Yeah, but I also feel like there's value to like the global citizens of the world, right? Yeah. The people who conceive of themselves as like belonging to the world. Because I think they also do important work. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. What are you most proud of about your home country? Home country here being Nigeria.
Okay, so you've decided that I'm not West African. See why they say you're condescending. We had a whole thing. We said I was West African.
Well, we have to identify it.
And then you did the thing that Nigerians do, which is like Nigerian supremacy, right?
Yeah.
So I'm from all these places, but then we just decided they don't matter.
No, you told me. when we were
this
looking
host-
at the different from Togo.
Guys, when
to-
you're watching this, just put in the comments that why is he doing this to her? We're like breaking the fourth wall here.
It's fine. You know what? Pick the country in West Africa that
No,
you want
I'm
to
happy.
identify
I'm a
with.
proud
Yeah.
Nigerian, so
Yeah,
I'm actually
yeah.
happy to. What am I proudest?
Most proud of, yeah.
I think it's the spirit. I think Nigeria is like really such a shit show, but we make it work.
Yeah.
You know, like sometimes you forget. So like I remember moving to Nigeria. I moved to Nigeria as an adult. I didn't grow up in Nigeria. And I remember just being in shock, right? Real and grand shock at the of it all, really. There's no polite way to say it. And then somehow, fast forward 10 years later, I'm actually celebrating 10 years of, living and being in Nigeria. And I can't, sometimes when people are shocked, I have to remind myself that yes, their experience is legitimate. Their experience is based in reality and in fact, and I have rose-colored glasses. So I think that ability, that thing that we as Nigerians have that I think keeps us going. I think it helps us to brave the next batch of crazy that comes our way. And I really love that quality of being Nigerian because I do think it makes for good entrepreneurial spirit. I think it makes for lots of courage to take on new adventure and do things in the world.
Yeah.
So I think answering as a Nigerian, that would be the thing I'm most proud of.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think is, because you've spent a lot of time in East Africa as well, in
Yeah.
Rwanda and Kenya, you spoke about Tanzania. What do you think is the biggest difference between East African money habits and West African money habits?
It's so interesting because that's a really good question. I was trying to conceptualize this to a friend, and this is going to force me to crystallize this properly. So, West Africa, I think, again, maybe because of the fragmentation, right? There's Francophone, there's even a little bit of the, Arab speaking, and then there's the Anglophone. And then you have East Africa, which has more of a bit of a cohesion. The money means, even though you have different currencies, the money kind of makes sense to you all in the same way. So I think that the way that spending happens here, the way that budgeting happens here, and planning happens here is a bit more intentional. Whereas I think that what I notice, and this is broad strokes, generalizations, right? So, I mean, let me caveat that before somebody loses their shits in the comments. But, but I think what I do see is more fiscal intentionality here than I see on the West.
Yeah.
And I think it's because it's easier for you to make sense, like to plan around something that you can make sense of. But trying to make sense of your SAFA vis-a-vis your CD, vis-a-vis your Naira, some of it is like, controlled, FX controlled by the government. Some of it is controlled by, their colonizer. So there's just too many things that I think making money make sense in that part of the world. And we also don't quite still have that. So if you think about other places where, and actually in West Africa as well, like in Sierra Leone, where there's a nice, and Liberia, they kind of default a bit to the dollar. So in those contexts, I think there's also a little bit more intentionality. But I think on average, because the currency is not, like the math is not mathing, people are just kind of like getting through life. They're just, if they have money today, they're spending it. And if they don't have money today, they're figuring it out. As opposed to, I think here where, and I don't think it's just a function of, I guess what I'm trying to say really badly is that as a function of there being sort of really good or much better, maybe it's not good, but it's better, political structure, fiscal regime, it's easier and therefore more likely that people are planning around their money habits than not.
Yeah.
Right? I more routinely see my East African friends recognizing when they're misspending or when they have like shopaholic habits.
Right.
Whereas I think for like my West African friends, it's been couched as something else. Survival, let me just do it. So a lot, and all those things are true, right? But you get what I'm saying.
Yeah,
like thinking
yeah.
about it plainly from a money management point of view, that sense of this is just fiscally irresponsible doesn't quite exist in the same way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, I I remember when I first realized that the naira is weaker than the shilling. I must have been in high school or some, when I was conscious of it. And I remember being very surprised because in Nigeria, you have such a big brand and you talk a lot and talk very loudly. So I remember I was like, wait, these guys are like,
That's the magic, right? That's the magic.
Like their currency isn't as strong as I remember. We had students from Tanzania who were in our school, and we'd make fun of them all the time about how it's very easy to make $1 million in Tanzania because it's X Kenya shillings. And anyway, I just always thought that the naira was going to be a lot stronger than it actually is. My last question on this sort of space is. What did it, if you have any thoughts, what did it look like for you to see the uproar that had been here over the last 2 months with the protests and trying to push accountability, I guess, as an West African looking in, and sort of having some context of what Kenya is like? What was that like for you?
I think whenever I see young people like ourselves, but even younger than us, pushing for more accountability on the continent, I'm so relieved, right? And I root for it. I hope it goes well. I hope the outcomes, because I think, taking Nigeria as an example, there was the NSARS thing that ended so sadly and broke a lot of spirits, mine included, because the government's reaction clearly reflected that we weren't valued, and we were kind of just seen as part of a machinery that was already going, and you kind of get in line or you get shot. And I think obviously there was violence here and there was a clampdown here as well, but I think that there was more momentum. I think there was also better organization here, actually. So honestly, I loved seeing it. I was rooting, things were getting cancelled. There were conferences, meetings. People were like, I think the Muzungus were stressed and they were like, we need to leave and all these things. So I think that, I think all these things, obviously they're disruptive, they cause problems, but I think asking for accountability, then if you're not getting it, demanding that accountability is such an important part of the civic process. And it's an often maligned part of it. I think there's a tendency, because it's inconvenient, because it's annoying, because there will always be bad actors who, throw themselves into the mix and, create problems. We sometimes malign the importance of civic action, civil unrest, disruption to the status quo, as a way to say, hey, like one of my favorite things we're seeing in some of my group chats with Kenyans, like people sharing, this is this person, this is how much they're paid, this is what they're spending, make it make sense. Like this kind of accountability, I don't really see as much in our part of the world.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the hardest things for me was seeing people who were entrusted to, serve the state, living really big lives, living really large. It doesn't make sense how it's happening because they don't have other jobs.
Yes.
Right? And we don't know anything about their other sources of income because they've not been appropriately disclosed, as they should be in the public service. But then everyone's kind of looking at that and holding that as a standard of like, oh yeah, this guy, he's so great. This woman, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, the lack of transparency here should be alarming. The lack of accountability here should give us pause, And so I think for me, I loved it.
Yeah.
I rooted for it. And I hope that it's the beginning of a kind of sense of political awareness that demands and expects accountability. I hope there's less violence and, all of that. But I think having young people who expect their leaders to account for themselves is very good for all of us.
Yeah.
It's very good for all of us. And I think it has great consequences even for our home lives, because also growing up and not seeing your parents be accountable, for how they're spending, what they're doing, I don't think it's good habits, actually.
Yeah.
I think that having charity begins at home. I think having a practice of more accountability in our society is good for all of us,
Better for all of
especially
us.
this continent. Just switching gears for a slight second to the fund, one of the things that we're really invested in is tools for driving transparency and accountability. We want to back those kinds of ventures because we know that that's a really hard problem to crack. There's so many political, social, cultural, historical things that work against building that kind of accountability infra, but so many upsides to have in having that kind of, so we're very excited about that.
Yeah.
One of the things that my partner and I always talk about, so not with the fund, like my life partner, is how hard it is to do actual trading. He's been in energy for a long time. Now, if you're trying to trade in Africa, right, you're trying to do anything from Ghana all the way to Namibia, which is sort of considered, I think, West Africa. You have to benchmark it against foreign indicators because we don't provide that amount of transparency about our product, where our product is coming from, how much we're pricing at, how much we're buying at, how much we're selling at. And that makes it really, really difficult, actually, for traders to operate. It creates lots and lots of leakages, increases the likelihood of tax fraud and all of these things. But trying to fix that problem, also incredibly difficult, And I think issues like that are why it's so hard to have forward momentum, because I think we push against things that are in our best interest, and we make it hard for young people to say, we just want better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Makes sense. All right. So where did you actually grow up?
What do we mean by growing up? Let's get philosophical.
Formative years. Let's say, philosophical about it.
No, I'm just saying, like, when you say grow up,
Up,
is it when I developed a sense of identity? Is it where I hit puberty?
Between ages 0 to 10.
Oh, okay. 0
Ages
to
0
10.
to 10,
0
yes.
to 10. That's easy. So 0 to 10 was spending a lot of time in Ghana, in the UK, 0 to 10 in Togo, in Benin. Yeah.
What's the reason for those are like 5 different countries?
So my mom, I was telling you, my parents are kind of like mixed origin. And each of my great grandparents, so that's 8 of them, is from a different country, right? By, country terms. So I think it was just moving around to see family, my mom's job as well. So my mom was one of those early people at EcoBank. And EcoBank had this big vision to connect the continent with financial services. And so that also meant a little bit of moving around. So yeah, that mixture of seeing family, my mom's work, my dad's work. My father was, I guess, we don't say that anymore, right? Now people are founders, right? But he was a businessman, right? That's what we used to call them, right? So he was a businessman, and he had interests across a variety of sectors. And so that also meant a little bit of movement as well.
That's interesting, actually. When I think about it, when I was like in class 5, like that's what people's fathers or mothers who didn't have traditional work were business men and women. Anyway,
so he was a businmasman.
Yeah.
Maybe today he'd be called a founder or an entrepreneur. Yeah. Fancy language we can't spell.
Okay. What was money like?
A question and a half. So complex. My dad was very wealthy.
What's the definition of very wealthy?
No,
we had someone on the podcast whose dad bought their mom a company for their birthday.
Yeah.
Was it that level of wealthy?
Yeah, he was, but not generous with us.
Okay.
So my dad had very interesting politics around money and around us. So to give you context, my dad died over 20 plus years ago. In my dad's estate, he accounted for taking care of his family members and setting up a trust for us. To date, that trust is still taking care of those family members and making disbursements regularly to us.
20 years later.
Yeah, 20 plus years later. So just to give you a sense of how much wealth he accumulated. But we didn't grow up like that, right? Well, I guess my older siblings did, but my dad was complicated. I think he was wounded in many ways from his own struggles and so his family was wealthy, but then he did this thing where he decided that he didn't want to go to uni, and it created a lot of friction. And so I think he had a lot to prove because he was disowned. And so he had to go out on his own and like make his own thing. And I think that created its own tensions and conflicts. It's funny, I've never liked my dad.
You've never liked him?
Never liked him, never respected him. But as an adult, spending more time with his friends, the people who loved him and respected him, I have more context for who he was. Like, I couldn't stand my mother for the longest time because I was like, what were you doing with that dude, right? And it took a long time to even start to hear her talk about him and not feel like I don't want to hear it, right? Because he wasn't great, right? Because he did weird things. So, like, my dad would do this super weird thing where the Nintendo comes out, he'll buy 10 of them because he can. And then he would give them out to my cousins and then lock 2 in the storeroom in our house and say, no, we can't have them. It's like, then why bring them home? Like, why do we need to know? We routinely had piles and piles and piles of food in the house that was under lock and key. And you couldn't access it. In fact, when my dad died, so my dad died when I was about 9, I think. One of the things that, I mean, in addition to relatives rushing in and trying to steal things and grab things, one of the funniest things that happened was breaking open some of the storerooms and seeing food that had just gone bad.
Because how many storerooms were there?
Bruh. Do you know what I mean? So it was a weird upbringing. So I would say that we didn't lack for fundamentals, right? So we went to good schools. We traveled, you know, for holidays. We had all the basics, but there was nothing extra for our experience. So, like, for instance, for Christmas, we got stationery, like pencils, highlighters. You know what I mean? And then, like, my cousins would get, like, fancy things. So it was a weird dynamic where, like, I remember I used to get so annoyed where we'd be called rich kids because we'd come to school in, like, a Land Cruiser. But it's like, I can't even ask for the backpack I want. You know, I remember my dad really sort of going off at my brother because he asked for some kicks. And my dad just basically told him, like, who the fuck does he think he is, right? Like, you know, he had all kinds of really
So you had, like, when I picture in my head.
So we lived in a nice house.
Like Lego
really nice house.
I picture,
we lived in a nice house, a big house. Wherever we were, right? Because we, like I said, we moved. So wherever we were in big houses, nice houses, cars, drivers, nannies. But, like, you didn't... Dude, I remember my brother stealing sugar because we were, like... And, like, stuff. Like, because we had set meal times, right? So breakfast, lunch, dinner. We weren't allowed snacks. We had allocated time for watching TV and stuff like that. So it created really weird behavior, like people going into the kitchen and, like, stealing food because it wasn't food time, but you were hungry and there was no allowance for being able to do that. So it was weird, right? We were, I think, perceived as very wealthy.
And your family was very wealthy.
Right. But our experience was so restrictive. There was no generosity to us, you know. And that was really weird. For me, it actually made my relationship to money and having money really weird for a long time. But yeah, so that was my dad.
I have 2 questions on that. The first one being, I mean, what would be your guesstimate around how much your dad was worth? Like, if you were to guess an amount of what he was worth, what would it be? And then 2, you talked about the trust fund. Was he generous in the trust fund, or did he keep the same?
Like, he was practical,
energy?
right?
Yeah.
No, I actually have a lot of respect for my father's will. So my father's will basically said, you need to make sure that my very last child finishes uni and is fully paid for, or until she turns 25 before you make any sort of dissolution. So they weren't allowed to sell assets or do anything until, except for the assets that he distributed to other people. They weren't allowed to do anything until my youngest sibling turned 25 or until she finished uni, whichever happened first. So he was smart about those things, right? He said, make sure my siblings get, like his siblings get an allowance each month, and so he took care of everyone like a good African would, and there were enough resources to in fact,
around.
It's so funny because the lawyer managing my father's estate, the law firm, recently resigned, and we've been laughing about it, that like, you've lived off of us for 20 plus years. Now that the money is winding down, you're just like, let me come out. Because there's only a few things left. My sister is now way past 25, and so there's only a few things left to kind of distribute. So, I couldn't even tell you the number, but, to give you a sense, he had assets all over the world. He worked in oil and gas. He worked in real estate, in agriculture. We had farms, warehouses, so I really don't know. I don't even know what that number would look like, but, and he liked nice things, like my dad bought nice things for himself. I think also for my mom. Yeah. So he, we always, I always saw so I grew up, in fact, we were joking the other day with a few friends of mine, because I was talking about like having fax machines and laptops and computers at home. So we grew up with things like, in the house, there were always nice bags. We had nice bars, nice drinks. So like, I knew a lot about, I think, being in certain kinds of spaces and feeling like they were familiar, but not feeling comfortable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Based off of the context you've given before, it does make sense. Okay. So, but what I was really curious to find out about the estate and the planning was, did you feel like he still wasn't generous with you even in his death?
I feel that as an adult, I really feel no sense of entitlement to his money. So I don't feel that. I think as a child, like, you just want your parents to like shower you with things and buy you a nice bag that you wanted, or, that kind of thing. And that didn't happen. I think once I hit, I started working when I graduated from junior high school, which is 14. After that, honestly, I have no expectations. In fact, when the disbursements first started happening, I was like, I don't want them. And I asked my mom to have them.
How much were they?
Different amounts, right? Because it's just based on, so sometimes there's a $20,000 disbursement. Sometimes there's, more of that. Sometimes there's $2,000. It just sort of depends, right? Because it's based on what's sold and, that kind of thing. And so I don't feel a sense. So like, my siblings are way more... Some of my siblings, not all of them, are definitely, they do have a stronger sense of entitlement to his wealth than I do. Like I said, I didn't really rate the chap, and I feel like it's nice that, like,
man,
I respect what he did for his family.
I don't think I've ever had anybody refer to their father as a chap.
But you get what I'm saying.
You have such a visceral reaction to it.
I do. On processed trauma, because you see, nobody's ever asked me this before. So you're getting this raw and unedited, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure I'm going to watch some of this and cringe at myself. But, you
like
live
it is
once.
What it, yeah. Like it is what it is.
You live once. But yeah, honestly, like, I think he did a great job. I respect his... I've had friends' dads pass away, and everything falls apart, really. And to be clear, there was a period when my dad died where, usual African family nonsense, where we didn't have access to anything. My mother was really, she's a hero. I love her, I respect her so much. She held everything down and made magic happen. And that was a difficult time, I think, financially. That's when I felt a sense of like, oh, actually, this is what it means to not have right?
what you had before.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think I was able to compare those two things because there was definitely that period. So I think there was a window where they were, some of the family trustees were fighting for us to get what we were entitled to. And some people were like, no, he's my brother. Nah, nah, nah. So there was that window.
Yeah.
But I think he did a great job. I think he did better than most.
As a legacy.
Yes,
yeah.
and as better than most Africans, right? So many people die, interstate. They
How
don't
old was he
organize
when-
things.
when he passed
He
away,
was
if you don't
63. So there's a 24-year age gap between
Okay.
him and my mom.
Okay.
So he was much older when he died. He had a good time with his life. Like he lived a good life, had lots of women, all of that stuff. You know what I mean? He was like a cliche, honestly. And I think that's why I'm just like, be more imaginative, right? Like, just classic African rich man.
Yeah.
You
But
know?
do you think that it sounds like detest, but not detest, but
Yeah.
whatever feeling it is you have towards your father, do you
Yeah.
think it had a lot to do with money?
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say I detest him. I think right now, I think the best way to say is I don't rate. Like,
Just
I don't
don't
have
rate
the
him.
same, like my siblings, like they'll be like, we must honor our daddy. And I'm
Yeah.
just like, okay, cool. I don't have that same sense of, I think I'm just like, cool. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I don't think it had to do with money. He was cruel. He was cruel to us. He was cruel to my mom. And I think for me, I was just like, why? And it wasn't so important to me anyway
Yeah.
to have... You just want to feel loved,
Yeah.
as a kid.
Yeah.
You want to feel wanted. Like my dad did this really weird thing where he sent me away and, because he was like, I don't want to be a parent right now. And so like my very, very early years, I didn't live at home. So I was going to a really fancy school with all these rich kids, but I was living in a slum with a distant relative of his because he was in a phase where he was like,
I don't want to be a parent.
not really trying to be a parent.
Yeah.
I want to be like flying with my young wife and showing her off. And this like daddy thing is kind of
Yeah.
So I also had a very difficult... So I've always had to straddle two worlds. Like there's sometimes there are things my mother does and she's just like, man, this place that you went to stay, like because I also can be very like what they would call Raz. Like I'm very, because I grew up in slums at a point in my life and I was very young and so I feel very comfortable in certain places that people are like, why do you feel so comfortable here? But so I think he was just cruel. That's it has nothing to do with the money because I think money wise, being honest and not being spoiled, those years, we had things, we had food, it's just at set times of day. We had nice beds.
I mean, and if you've
and
talked
nice
to your mom
rooms.
about some of those things, has she given you an explanation as to why some of those things happen? Like not having snacks or not being able to have snacks or the Nintendo's being locked
I think
up.
my mother was going through her own trauma in that marriage,
Right.
So I think, I've never talked to her. To be fair, like, you're the only person in my... And it's very interesting to be doing this, like...
On a podcast.
I've never talked about my life in that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's... I've talked to my mother about being with my dad, staying with my dad, some of her choices. My dad died when she was young. She was sub 40 when he died, so she could have remarried. But like, for context, she was so traumatized from that. Like, I don't think, like, my mom's still single 20 plus years later.
She's like, nah.
She's like, I'm done. And she wouldn't admit it, right? She'd be like, marriage is good, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But she knows, like, I'm done. I had a fill and I'm good.
Yeah.
So I talked to her about other things, being a woman, being a wife. But I don't really talk about my dad.
Okay.
Actually, I don't even really talk to my siblings about it. I don't think we've ever had an honest conversation about the fact that one of my brothers would probably had killed him if he hadn't died, because there was so much abuse, physical, emotional, in the household that, as those boys were becoming men, something would have popped off.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah.
So he died when you were 9. So from 9, you're on the estate. Of course, you talked about the sort of the difficult period that you guys potentially went through at that point. how difficult was difficult? If you give us a description.
I mean, it wasn't like when I was living in slums, right?
Okay, right.
But it was just like, then you think about school fees,
Yeah.
right? Like before then, I'd never thought about whether we went to expensive schools, and I'd never thought about, will my school fees get paid? But I suddenly had to think about, how's my mom gonna pay our school fees? How much is my school fees? Not asking for an allowance because I know what my mom is trying to do. And mind you, she's not just taking care of us, she's taking care of the other kids, like my dad's other kids as well. Taking care of the household, managing the household. The estate, people in the estate, managing the estate are trying, but there's friction. There's also things that need to be tidied up in the estate and all of that. So, yeah, I think it was psychologically hard, right? Like, I don't think I can remember ever going to bed starving because there was no food in the house or something like that. But you just make certain decisions like, oh, hey, we can't afford to go do 2 trips. So you have to wait 3 hours past closing time so that we can do 1 trip. So just economies that have to happen when you have to, I think, have a middle class life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say it was, there were just considerations, right? Because I think when you have a lot, you don't think about practical things like holiday, school fees and fuel
they'll
and
happen,
transportation and all of that, because they just happen, right? And then your problems are more like, I didn't get that nice shoe, or I didn't get a nice Christmas present, or, those sorts of things. And then when that shifts, you then see the difference, Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So how did you decide what you're going to study in uni, and how did you get to uni and sort of that period? What's that period like?
Yeah. Uni. So uni was, really from very young. So I was identified as intellectually gifted, and was then, like Africans do, pushed into the sciences, which I enjoyed. And then I wanted to be a doctor, also because of the way my dad passed was so silly. And I just thought healthcare should be better. So? Basically, the hospital ran out of oxygen, and there were no monitoring systems, so he just kind of just died.
So he's like suffocated.
Yeah, it was very dumb, Yeah, it was silly.
Yeah.
So I think, for me, healthcare was always one of those things that I was like propelled toward. And so I actually went into uni wanting to be a doctor, world-class surgeon, blah, blah, blah. In uni, but just to answer your question a different way, I never made my choice for what I would study based on how much I would make. Because I think, just coming back to this idea of formative years, I think growing up in a place where I did fundamentally think or feel like, everything will be fine financially, meant that I never had to make decisions like, oh, I must study finance so that I can get a good job. I had friends who had to make that choice. I never thought, oh, if I don't do X, then I won't have a good degree. I just pursued things that were of interest to me and things that I was good at. And I think that is privilege, right? That even sometimes I wasn't always aware of. So there was that. But I chose based on just what I was interested in, what I excelled at. I remember I was valedictorian of my high school class, and they bought me all these like medical school books, Grey's Anatomy and all these things. So everyone knew like Kristin was going to become a doctor.
It's really interesting though.
Yeah.
Because you seem like from a very young age, you had determined that you didn't quite like your dad.
Yeah.
But you're pursuing medicine because he died from something silly.
Because I hate waste. Always have. And I think the continent is in a constant
do you not think it has
waste.
any, and I'm not trying to be a couch therapist or anything, but you don't think it has any connection whatsoever
with him?
Yeah.
But I'm not a doctor, so
no. maybe halfway through you are like, nah, I'm not gonna save this guy.
Okay, let me put it this way. I didn't want to become a doctor because I loved my dad and I lost my dad.
Yeah.
But maybe I did want to become a doctor because I
I'm
thought...
like an OD to him or something.
Yeah, maybe. But I don't think it was about him. I think it was like, if you're doing all of this, right? He was flying out for treatment. He had cancer. Flying out for treatments, doing all of these things. He was getting better, blah, blah, blah. And then to just die because you don't have proper monitoring equipment, the nurse was probably sleepy and so fell asleep, and then the man just dies. Like, it's so wasteful.
Yeah.
Like,
No.
let this man die because my brother beats him to death or something. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, let us know
I
that.
get what you mean.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when I asked you, when you talked about being a doctor, the first thing you said was, my dad died of something silly.
It was a crystallizing moment for
Yeah.
me. It was
Okay.
like the moment when I realized that I didn't understand God, right? It was one of those moments where definitely him dying affected what I wanted to be when I grew up.
Okay.
But not in a kind of like justice for my father way.
Yeah.
Just in a justice for everyone who has to deal with this bullshit system way,
Yeah.
you know? And it's still happening. My friend's mom just passed away because of oxygen again. Insane. And you know, a lot of people don't know how often that happens. Hospitals, clinics run out of oxygen. And there was like a mini period during COVID where we shed a spotlight on it, and then it just went away.
But
I volunteered on a project for the government to create oxygen labs. And then, you know, the things that happen,
Yeah.
and it never happened.
Yeah.
So that factory doesn't exist. But it's such a silly thing. It's oxygen, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. So you start pre-med,
Yeah.
right? And then, so what happens? How do you then shift?
So many things.
Yeah.
I always knew I wanted to return to the continent.
Because, well, for context, where are you at this point in time?
I'm in the US, right? And I've spent so much of my life, like after 10, away from the continent, as it were. And I'm being told that that's what it means to succeed. It means going away. It means making it in America or the UK or whatever. And I feel that there's something wrong with that picture. And so I think subconsciously, psychologically, I know that I want to return to the continent. But then I'm pursuing this thing. I want to be a cardiothoracic surgeon. I'm looking at surgeries. I'm shadowing doctors. I'm seeing the cost of equipment. At that time, like laparoscopic surgery was really coming up, really expensive to do. The training, the cost of your education. I was just doing the math, and I just thought, if I continue along this path, I couldn't really see a realistic way for me to be living and working as a doctor back home, as a surgeon, for at least another 20, 30 years. And I was like, so there's no way I'm dealing with more of this whiteness. Like, I just knew I wanted to be back home. I wanted to be around people that didn't see me as an oddity or as like, oh, wow, the black girl, she's so smart. Like, I was just tired of all of that. So I started...
How smart are you?
I don't
This is
know.
like the second time you've said
And
it.
is that they said? I said they said it.
Yeah.
Because by my estimation,
Yeah.
I'm pretty average. But you know how it is, right?
Yeah.
You're good at some things, and people are like, oh, whatever. And so,
But I also asked that because of the colleges you've been to. Because let me check.
don't do that.
No, I want to check because
See, the audience is supposed to be on my side.
because that's the reason I'm asking, because it is a
Wow, are you really doing that?
Yeah, I am. So you go to Columbia University, right, for summer school for biomedical engineering.
Wow.
University of Pennsylvania, summer school medicine.
Wow.
Harvard University.
Wow. Where did you find all these things?
Princeton. You have your bachelor's degree in comparative literature from Princeton. Then University of Oxford.
Wow. We can stop now.
Then Stanford.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, those aren't, average universities.
Maybe it was like they needed like affirmative action, black women, African women. You never know. Like all these things coalesce in your favor. No. So I intellectually gifted. Let me not be disingenuous. I am. But I just couldn't see making a life in that way on the continent.
Right.
And as a result, I started thinking about what my options could be. However, I still wasn't brave enough at that moment, actually, to say I'm not going to be a doctor. Because if anyone who knew me up until that point, like from age maybe 9 or whatever, until I went then, knew Kristin's going to be a doctor. That was just it. So even internally, I was really struggling with, okay, so what are you going to do? How do you tell people? How do you... Because it was like my... You know when you just like build your identity around something? And I'd really done that. But then my boyfriend at the time, we're in Paris, and he just collapses. And I had training, basic life support training, and I'm giving him CPR, and he's just... And I think watching him die...
Sorry, what?
Yes. That traumatized the shit out of me. And that gave me a kind of courage to just be like, no, I'm actually not going to do this.
No, you said that very casually.
I know. It's because I want to move away quickly from it.
No, like you said that very, very casually.
Yeah. But yeah, that did something.
Yeah, like that's first of all,
yeah.
First of all, you said Paris. I'm trying to put many things together here. So first of all, you come from the States, you're in Paris, with your boyfriend. Again, and I'm also still thinking, so this life that you're living at this point in time is still being funded by the estate.
No, I was on a scholarship.
Oh, at this point in time.
Yeah, because so the good thing also with my education, I was lucky because I did well. I got,
Okay.
I had scholarships. And things
Okay.
like that.
All right. Yeah. So you guys are just walking.
Yeah.
And he just collapses.
He does. So turns out he had a heart condition. I didn't know all of these things. And he dies right there. I didn't realize it then, but he had died.
Yeah.
When he hit the ground. But that process of all the CPR and all the, when something just is rearranged inside of you. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I can't save lives. I'm not going to save lives. Like, it's okay. Go find something else to do.
Okay.
And so I think that created a radical shift. So that's when I changed my major. Mm-hmm. So I didn't actually enter Princeton as complete. Mm-hmm. So if you look at my minors, it was like neuroscience, biophysics, and all of that, because I entered and then I switched my major because I was like, I need to check out. There were other things that happened, right? Because life is like that. It's not just one thing, really. Sometimes when you're telling the story, it makes it seem like my advisors who I started working with when I came to Princeton, many of them had moved on to other universities. So there was also a lot of anxiety for me because at Princeton, you have multiple sort of projects that you do leading up to your dissertation, your graduate in your department, particularly in the sciences. And I couldn't think of who I was going to work with for my dissertation because the person I would have wanted to work with, in fact, 2 of them had all left the university. So there were other things feeding into that, but still I wasn't courageous enough until that moment where I was just like, you know what? Mm-hmm. Not doing this. Like, I'm going to figure out a new path.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a couple left field questions based on that incident in Paris. Was your boyfriend from France or were you traveling?
No, he was Italian, actually. He was Italian, so I met him. It was like a summer thing. It was fun.
Right. Okay.
It was
because I was going to. So I was like, what happens thereafter?
Yeah, it was really awkward meeting his parents. His mom, who doesn't even speak English. I barely speak Italian. She doesn't know who I am. Who's this black girl?
Yeah.
I was still in my white boy phase then. Mm-hmm. She's like, who's this black girl? Like, what is she saying?
Yeah.
Like, my son is dead. Like, just too many things. It was a very traumatic experience, to be honest. I talk about it like it wasn't, but it really was.
I can only imagine.
So we'd met in Paris. And
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. Anyway, okay. So you go back to college, you're doing well, intellectually gifted, and moving on, and etc. So when did you start making your own money? I mean, I know you had earlier mentioned you started working really young, like at 14.
Oh yeah, so from the beginning, even as a college, I had a job.
You're working all through.
I'm working.
And what are you doing with your money at that point?
So many different things. I'm saving. I was saving a lot. And then I was traveling. That was what I was mostly doing. But then, around that time, Bitcoin, right? And I don't know how much you know about Princeton, but like computational research, all of those things are a big part of the work we're doing. So there's a few people involved in that stuff. So people are like, you want to buy some of this, blah, blah, blah. So I buy a little Bitcoin.
How much? What?
Then about $2,000. So you can imagine it was a fair amount. And so then people start things, you support here and there. And so I invested in a few things. Again, not much, 5K, 10K.
Dollars.
Yeah. And also about that same time, the estate starts sending reimbursements, because like my mom had paid for things. And then I had paid for things.
Right.
So they're sending reimbursements. So not even disbursements, just like reimbursements, because per the will, those things should have been paid for by the estates. So I'm liquid, right? So I'm traveling, I'm investing.
And how old are you at this point?
18, 19, 20, 21,
Okay.
22. So early, right? Yeah. And so then I sort of get a taste for investing, speculating, trying things out. And I think that then begins my foray into investing as an angel, supporting projects, and making a little bit of money. So, yeah.
How much did the Bitcoin end up being worth? Did
It was a lot. I actually just lost it. I lost a good chunk of it. Because, back then we didn't have hot wallets. We had cold wallets. So if you lost your... So I remember there was...
they're a bit like, what are they called? Bearer bonds. Like whoever has...
So and it was in a hard drive on my laptop. So I lost a good chunk of it. But I also made money. Because, I mean, I know some people are very good and they just buy it and they leave it. But sometimes you take a little bit out. So I had made a little bit off of it. But most of it, like the lion's share of it, was just lost in a dead hard drive, which is fine. Like I made peace with that. But it was in the millions. It would have been at that point. But it happens, right? It's also because I think my attitude to money is really that theoretical money is not money, right? Money has to be. Otherwise, for me, it's all just like, like people like sometimes, because sometimes I'm broke. I'm like, I'm broke. And then a friend be like, no, you're not broke. And then they want to start listing assets to me. I'm like, bruh, that's not money in my hands. Yeah. I understand you, so I don't know. I mean, I'm one of the cash is king people, right? Yeah. Even though like I do acquire assets, I buy land, I buy things, just because I think that those are important for long-term planning and like wealth creation. But like me, cash is king, like have money in your bank account. Yeah. But yeah, so then that's when I start doing that.
Okay. Yeah. So what's the next big money thing that happens in your life after that? Is it employment that comes in?
I started working, consulting. Then one of the deals I did, they called me and they were like, we sold. That was a nice 200K. So yeah, and then just...
So it's like a commission off of...
No, like a return.
Oh,
like
right,
an equity.
right. Oh, right.
Yeah,
one of the whatever you invested
deals,
in.
Yeah. So then, and then,
from there, you then sort of...
So that just became my life. And especially because at the time, like I was consulting, I was doing, so, you make some money here and there, 10K, 15, 20, 50, whatever. And so, that was my life. And I was traveling. So I've never really been... So my philosophy of money is... I'm not like I don't have too much money in my savings accounts. If I hit a certain level, I buy something. I buy an asset. But I want enough cash flow that I can deal with an emergency and that I can have an okay life. Like I can deal with the different things that I need to do. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. So how many...
So I do take a lot of risk. I invest in things. I take bets. I routinely lose money all the time. Like all the time. Like I think...
What's the most recent... I really hope
my mother doesn't listen to this because she's an accountant. She'll not be proud of me. Yeah. No, I've lost like upwards of 100K.
Like this year, what have you lost?
Oh, this year? No, I haven't really lost money this year because I haven't done too much. Because, setting up the fund, investing in my company, my partner quit his job. So I'm not taking as much risk
right now.
Yeah. In fact, I don't think I've lost money this year. I cashed out on Nvidia this year because I invested back in 2018.
How much did you invest?
10K.
And how much did you cash out at?
Just do the math. Let's
Collins, what are they cashing out at?
let's not be grotesque.
Collins will tell us. Yeah,
wow.
I don't know. I don't know.
So
Yeah.
but I think I'm young. I have really good risk appetite.
Yeah.
So I try things. So like that's why sometimes I'm just really poor, right? I mean, well, not poor, broke, right?
Yeah,
I'm broke
Yeah.
because like I just made a lot of bad bets.
Yeah.
But I think I'm lucky. Like I'm lucky that I generally have a philosophy that when you are intentional, when you're working, and you're taking bets, money comes.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have a kind of like anxious attachment to money. I'm very like, let's try.
Do you have like, because when you're speaking before and saying, so you have a savings account. So if I'm to try and break down your
Yeah.
portfolio with whatever it is you can tell us, there's the investment stuff that you have. You have an emergency fund. Is it separate from your savings
It
fund?
is.
So you have an emergency fund, then you have the savings fund.
Yeah.
And then you have land.
Yeah.
Do you guys, I mean, West Africa, do you have the same thing here where people, I guess, will like buy land and build and try and do a lot of real estate?
Yeah, but I don't do any of that.
Yeah.
I just hold my land.
Like-
yeah. I'm just like, I'll sell it to somebody one
At some
day.
point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, yeah.
But it's not something that you're trying to actively make money
No.
from. Okay.
So I'm not. Also because I mean, I'm not really trying, which is a weird thing to say on a podcast like this, but I wouldn't say that I'm trying to build like wealth, like
Right.
crazy wealth. I
Right.
just want to have a comfortable life.
Right.
I'm looking for financial independence, not wealth. And those two things are not necessarily the same.
Yeah.
Right? So I structured my life to have that. Not necessarily, because there are decisions, there are things I could do with my money that would be, better for wealth building. But I just don't do them. Right. But I'm sure, like, I want to retire 40. So I'm sure maybe when I'm in that era, I'll be thinking about, or maybe I'll have bandwidth to think about those things. But for me, the goal has always been I never want to make decisions based on money. I don't want to pick a job because I'm broke. I don't want to not pick a job because I'm broke. I don't want to not do something, like, do you know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
that's what I pursue in my life, actually, is giving myself enough cover to not make decisions
Based on money. What's the brokest you've been as an adult?
Oh, like zero cash. Like, I've been there.
But you talk about zero cash, but you have assets.
Yeah. Like, you have investments, you have bonds, so you have
Yeah.
to, like, dissolve a few things.
Yeah.
You
What's been the worst?
Dip into
Yeah.
your
What's been
savings.
your worst financial position?
zero cash.
No, but what does zero cash mean? Like
Like
on
I
that
have
on
no
that day you
liquidity.
you couldn't get food, you couldn't pay
Oh,
your bills.
no, I never have that, right?
Yeah.
There's always food. I mean, things I picked up from my dad, right? I have storerooms full of I literally, my mother's always just like, she's always concerned about
Yeah.
that. She's like, why do you have so much food?
Yeah.
So I've never, like, I know every home I own, there's food. There's basics. I always buy more electricity than I need. So, like, I've never been in a position where I'm like, oh, I can't pay for electricity or pay for water or any of those things. Because I always kind of, like, maybe buy a little more than I need of those things in every place that I am. So really, it would really be about cash flow, right? Being able to have nice things or nicer things, or, being able to do certain things. And there for me, it's just I work, right? If I need money, I'll just work, right? I go and look for who I can give value to, right? Or I liquidate something, right? I liquidate something so that I have some cash flow. So it really depends. But like, I like to work. I'm in my working era. I'm very happy to do hard work if I need to make some money. So it's like, because sometimes I do the math and I'm like, liquidating this is not smart. So instead I make a few calls. I'm like, hey, what can I do for you so you can give me some money?
Okay.
Yeah.
How much of your life have you spent in what do you call it? In employment vis-a-vis like independent consulting?
So I think I always, I don't know, what's a consultant? So I've never done like the whole, like, I'm always a contractor, consultant. My
Yeah.
virtue is independence,
Right.
actually.
So even now as a...
Like managing partners. So
Yes.
like so I either do things that I have equity in, right? I'm a founder, I run my company, or I'm a partner, or I consult, right?
Okay.
I've never really been, I've been an intern maybe, like early on. But I don't think I've ever done the employee thing. Because if somebody wants my time and my labor, I typically preference that they engage me as a contractor or a consultant rather than as an employee.
Is that purely just for the management of your time?
Yeah,
or
like
how you value your
I
time?
value independence. It's the thing I want most in life. I don't need to be rich. I don't need to be famous, but I want to have freedom. It's the highest virtue for me,
Okay.
When
you get married, what does that do for your financial life?
Yo. It's a conversation.
Yeah.
People tell you that, and I think my partner and I were lucky that we never had that thing where it's like, oh, finances is why we'll split up, right? We came up with better reasons to do that. But I see, we saw why, right? Because despite my better judgment, like we had an expensive wedding, right?
When you said despite your better judgment.
I never thought I'd be one of those people,
What happened?
I don't know. Family, me, things, I don't know. But I never thought we would do that kind of thing. But I can see how you do that. And but for instance, before we did that, so we got married without telling anyone. Private,
like law
legally,
office, legally, right, judge, right.
And then obviously my family's like, you must, So I think some of it was apology, right? Just make it nice, make it lavish.
Right.
And then we had to do the wedding they wanted and then the wedding we wanted. So then there were like multiple events, right? I mean, we didn't have to. Clearly, bad choices.
So even before you finish this story, before you continue the story, I just have one question. Did they do the money thing?
Yes.
How much because I hear if you don't smile, they keep...
Oh, really? I don't know about that. I didn't know that smiling
in Nigeria,
matters.
like the one for...
I think they just spray because, you must spray.
Maybe there's like social, misinformation. I don't know.
Yeah, you must just spray. Spraying
media.
is very important. Yeah, it's just part of the experience.
It's very important. and that's money you take.
To be fair, I think my event planners took that money. I don't know. I mean, I would. It's money on the floor.
Right,
I wouldn't have chased that.
Right.
But yeah. But I think, for instance, we made a decision to pay our rent 3 years in advance.
3 years in advance.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a bunch of things like that. So what that meant is post wedding, blah blah blah. When you're broke, you spent all your money on champagne and gifts and things. But we're not worried about rent. We're not worried about basic things, right? We've insured the vehicles. You know what I mean? And I think that those decisions really helped because I saw how, having to pay rent, having to, even my partner quitting his job, I saw how other people, somebody quitting their job, really put strain on the relationship. But for us, we had savings, we had cash flow. We were even, somebody was shading us that why is he doing all this traveling and spending of money? I was like, because he has a break. And that we don't know when the next break will come because he gets a new job and then it gets very intense. So we might as well, live life and enjoy. But being able to do that requires a lot of planning and strategy that I think a lot of couples don't think about, and a lot of transparency. So like I said, we didn't fight about financial mismanagement, but we fought about how much transparency I asked from him. Accounts, I want to see what is your actual cash position, how are you spending? And especially for a man, an African man, it's what's no, right? And that was hard. That was a constant process of and I would tax him. Right.
You would tax him?
Yeah, I'd be like, you owe the house this amount of money because you have this amount of money. So the household should get this from you. And because I know his cash position, I can tax him accurately and he would get really mad. It's why are you in my business? I'm like, because I'm your wife.
Yeah.
So yeah.
How difficult, because I'm hearing you talk about it was a difficult conversation, a difficult thing to get
it was fights.
It was.
No. I agree.
Yeah.
Because it's that one, men are not used to that kind of accountability, especially to a woman, and especially not a man who has lived his life, making money. He's been fine. He's taking care of his family. He's doing everything. So it's like, who are you to be looking into my finances, to be telling me, no, I can't do this. I must do this. I must have blah, blah, blah. But that's exactly what I was doing, because I was like, we need to be in a secure position so that we can absorb shocks, right? And I knew, because I dated him, that he was not setting up his finances for that. So, you know, but when you're his girlfriend, you're like, whatever.
So
his wife
one
will
of
have
those
that
things
problem.
where you said, I'm going to sort this out once I marry this man?
I think when we got married, I was like, oh, I have to sort this out. Because
But it wasn't your intention going
No,
in.
no. Girlfriend mode, you must just enjoy. Everywhere. You know, like, I feel really sad when women are like managing their boyfriends' lives. It's like, no, just enjoy.
Yeah.
When it's
It's not your
finished,
problem.
go.
Yeah.
You know, like, why are you helping this man? No. I mean, we would work together when we were dating, and, you know, as per, you know, but not me thinking about, how do you have a sustainable life? No, none of that. Because I'm just like, no, that's your mommy's problem or your girlfriend or whatever. You know. Also because we very quickly went from like messing around to married. Like the dating actual
Was quite
girlfriend
short,
was
yeah.
very short. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So-
But now you're on the same, you're on the same page, or closer to the same page.
No,
then.
we're definitely on the same page. Like we're team. But it was hard one. Like, because I think for him, it was just like, why? Like, who gave you this right? And I'm like, marriage certificate. You know?
I feel like you probably did that. I think that looks...
I really did it because we've lost our marriage certificate so many times.
Yeah.
So I don't even know where it is.
Yeah.
But no, I think for me, it was really just this idea that if our finances are going to be entwined, because it's not like if something happens to you, I'm going to leave it, you know, doing things like buying health insurance, life insurance, all those things, which are really, really important, right? I think a lot of people, you have a decent life, but you don't have insurance, you don't have, and so illness happens, something happens, and that really puts you know, and I think people underestimate those things, and that's what I mean by freedom. Because honestly, you could probably just use that money that you used to buy insurance to make some nice money, right? But I buy insurance because I think it's smarter.
Yeah.
And it gives me freedom long term.
Okay. How important do you think money is in achieving, for you, in you achieving happiness, on contentness in your life?
Not very important. Only as a function of how it affects my freedom. Right? I think for a lot of people, this is probably the case. They just don't realize it. Right? Because they're so anxious about money that they don't realize what the actual thing that they want that money to enable for them is. And I actually think that one of the key things for being able to reach your financial goals is understanding what those financial goals are in service of, because then you can make strategic decisions. Because if money is the point, you're going to be short-sighted. But if you know that, okay, I'm trying to hit X, then you know that, okay, the money is to enable X. And then you can make decisions that are in service of that. And I actually think that's really important, something that people don't think about a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're so anxious about the money itself.
Okay. So how did you end up setting up the fund? And where did you get the money to set up the fund?
So the fund is, I mean, it's a venture fund. So we are raising from LPs. CEO, we need to talk about this conversation cannot be to the fund because I don't know if my LPs should be hearing this. So I think you just need to introduce me because I don't know. Anyway, whatever. It is what it is. But no, so the fund was really, so with venture, the idea is that you, obviously, there's some GP commit, which we did. But then also you speak to LPs, limited partners, who then, and creating the fund was really saying there's a lot of conversation about issues with pipeline in the ecosystem, the quality of startups coming into the later stages, seed, Series A, being low quality or not good enough to get that investment. So there's lots of larger funds with dry powder that don't have funds and don't have ventures that they're excited about investing in. And so we wanted to do something that would really catalyze great ventures at the very early stage, so that those that are investing in pre-seed and seed would have ventures and founders that they're excited about. So for us, it was really a mission to boost the ecosystem and keep, because Christian, who's my co-founder, and I have both, we're both founders, we're both angel investors. And so we see how important it is, not just in terms of our own wealth creation, but in terms of the economy, our communities, being able to enable people with entrepreneurship in that way. And so the fund was really a way to say, let's catalyze the ecosystem better. Let's support. There's lots of ways and things to criticize about what's wrong in the ecosystem, but maybe this is our own contribution to that community so that there are stronger founders and stronger businesses that venture players, private equity players feel comfortable, backing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's been what, a year or just?
No. So we actually started this journey. It's not been up to a year. It's probably just 8 or 10 months.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, like at the beginning of the year was really when.
Yeah.
And then we announced in July, and so we're still very much in the process of setup. Talking to LPs, building relationships, building partnerships. Is really early days.
Yeah.
We haven't even done our first investment yet, but we're doing due diligence. We're talking to ventures. We're talking to founders. We're learning the things, because sometimes you think you know something, but then I think humility is, the highest form of intelligence. Asking those questions, getting people to tell you what they know. So that you can sharpen your thinking and sharpen the work that we. So we're really very much in that phase, getting our license in Rwanda, bringing more LPs into the fund, people who are going to back our mission, to catalyze these ventures.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, as I am wrapping up with our conversation, a couple of things there are like 2 final questions I want to.
Okay.
Well, no, 3 final questions I'll ask. But before that, we've done our research. And if you had invested, and this is again estimate, we don't know what's actually in your account, right? But if you had invested 10,000 USD in Nvidia in 2018, by 2020, if you're cashing out in 2024, you would have made 3.7 times your investment. So if you had made an investment of $10,000, you would have cashed out probably at about just under $37,000.
Yeah.
Which is a tidy sum. Also, allegedly. Also, for the audience, these are the kind of solutions that are available on the FX Pesa platform. These are the companies that you can trade on, and you can make money via this. So please check out the links in the description box.
Are you only doing the US companies? Yeah.
So to give context and I guess to answer your question, yes. So the US and EU
fantastic.
are covered under
so that's
under
I think
FX
even
Pesa.
a more robust plug because there's good stocks.
Good stocks there. Anyway, okay. Yeah. So, last couple of things I want to wind up. First, the different colleges that you've been to, what does it take to get, I guess as an intellectually gifted person, but what does it take to get scholarships into some of those spaces? What do you think it really takes? I mean, I know there's a hard work.
No, it's luck.
Yeah.
And affirmative action. No.
Yeah.
But I think research, right? I think a lot of people are just not aware of the opportunities available to them. So, and also not able to negotiate, right? So, for instance, when I applied to uni, I was able to leverage the fact that I had applied and successfully gained entry into other universities to ask for financial, scholarship. Because my university only gave scholarships what they called need-based. So what that meant was that they only gave you money if you needed it. And so you had to prove that you couldn't. And I really didn't qualify, unfortunately, in that sense. Because I couldn't present papers that said, like, my parents were poor or whatever. But I did feel like I needed it. Complicated family situation, right? But you can't prove that. But what I did do was negotiate. So I said, hey, I got into 8 other top-tier universities. They all want me. And I had different offers, right? Columbia had its own offer, And so I said, these are the offers I have. If you want me to choose, and at the time I wanted to go to Princeton. So if you want me to choose Princeton, you have to give me something. You have to make it make sense that I'm choosing as an African child to come and come here instead of coming where they're giving me a full ride and all of these things. So sometimes I think, 1, doing the research, 2, being confident and like clear enough to negotiate on your own behalf, all those things. But in terms of applying and getting in, I really think it's just even knowing, because sometimes there are even programs where they're looking for, right? Because sometimes you're looking for a certain profile of candidate, because programs are also trying to design so that the cohort can elicit something in the world or for the university or whatever. So sometimes like a program at Yale is looking for African professionals in the energy space because they're really looking to drive forward their thinking and their perspective on what's happening in renewable energy in Africa. Well, you're sitting there, you've been working in oil and gas for the last 10 years, you're thinking about going into school, that's a program you should apply for because they're offering full rides, they're more likely to be excited about your profile. So I think sometimes it's just like knowing these things, looking out for these things, doing your research. And it's boring, it's not interesting, but it's what gives you a leg up. It's what gives you an advantage.
Right.
So yeah, research I think is very often underrated and underdone. And then I think the other thing is maybe practice around like strengthening your weak areas. So for instance, if you know you're not good at writing long form essays, giving yourself enough time to do those well so that you can, successfully apply, or choosing schools that don't require long form essays and instead ask you to write short form. So maybe applying to places that lean into your strengths, right? Some people don't bother to think about should they be doing the GMAT versus the GRE versus the SAT or the ACT or whatever. So I think those things really help. And doing the research, like I think sometimes people think like their parents should do it for them or their guidance counselor or whatever, but just do it yourself.
Yeah.
Like you have the internet.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that's cool. Hopefully, that's be some good advice for someone from an intellectually gifted person.
Stop it. This is why they say you're condescending, because now you're mocking me.
Anyway,
Keep that in. Keep that in, audience, that he was mocking me.
My last two questions. Second last one.
Okay.
What do you wish your dad had taught you about
It's
money?
my dad. You're obsessed with
No,
my dad.
it's actually not. It's not even related so much to the
I'm
relationship
just kidding.
you had
I'm
with
just
him.
teasing.
You're the one who's mocking. Yeah, it's more about the fact that he was able to build a lot of wealth, right? So I'm curious. What do you think? What do you wish he had taught you about money?
That's a great question. Yeah, maybe how to make more of it easily.
Yeah.
I think, we were talking about that at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
How do you do this in an easier way? So
Yeah.
maybe that.
Yeah. Okay. Last question is what do you? I'm trying to find the politically correct way of phrasing this. But essentially, what I want to ask around is, what do you wish your mom didn't teach you about money by remaining married to your dad?
Okay. I want to answer that in two ways. First, I want to talk about all the my mother taught me everything I know about budgeting, financial management, financial accountability. She's a trained accountant, chartered
Right.
accountant. So really, I think taught me most of the useful things I know about keeping money. Right. Maybe not making money, but keeping money. And then in terms of so I don't really think that my mom stayed with my dad for financial reasons. I think she stayed with him for cultural reasons, right? Because she'd already done a thing by marrying somebody who was old or so much older and then was from a different culture. He wasn't from her culture. He wasn't from her country. Her parents were not in support of it. So I think when you do, like you say, I'm going to bulk the trend and do this thing, then there's a lot of, I think, like shame and reluctance to when you jump into the thing and you're like, actually, so I think that was more of it. But I do think watching the dynamic of my parents, right? And the dynamic between my dad and his family, what I did see was the way in which financial inequality can create a lot of negative situations. So what do I mean by that? There were lots of terrible things that my dad did that nobody called him out on because he was their financial provider, right? And so support that my mom should have had from his family to say, no, that's not good, that's not cool, he didn't have, right? Like my dad went and did a wedding with somebody else, and all his siblings were there because he's their breadwinner, like he's their financial provider, right? And you're not going to stand up to that person and say, no, you have a wife and, you know, children at home. So I think those were the lessons I learned about surrounding yourself with people for whom you're financially responsible, and so they can no longer like speak the truth to you. So I think those were instead the ways
things
in
you took
which
from it.
I
Okay.
took away from that. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, that brings me to the end of our conversation.
I'm so worried about this conversation.
I enjoyed it. I think it was good. I think it had, unexpected turns.
I'm telling you.
Yeah, a really, really interesting story. A really interesting money story. I think, we've had people who've come from very wealthy households who sat on that seat and told us some interesting tales and how things either fell apart or how things grew. And yours is yet another twist in another twist in the tale. So anyway, thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you guys next Friday on the next episode of Financially Incorrect.